So if you follow me on Twitter, then you know that when I'm not being cranky or angry or sad at the state of the world, or ceaselessly disappointed in James Woods, or cranky, Saturday, do you say we you by also the so the way the oh, You know, I really did love Mona. There's no need to pray. It's okay, we welcome. Mona was probably my favorite movie to come out of Disney Animation Studios since the 90s. It was, simple movie, buddy comedy, but tight and well done, and I loved it. And you know what else I love? Disney villains. You know, that thing Mona didn't really have. Well, Terminator hasn't always been this glam. I mean, it kinda did, but not in that, like, classic Disney villain kinda way. Thinking you could defeat me, the mistress of all evil. Disney villains are probably my favorite aspect to all of Disney animated canon. And I'm not alone. Disney has noticed this. I went to Disney World last year, and probably my favorite thing I did was this new thing called Club Villain, and it was great. It was hosted by Dr. Facilier, and we got to chill and hang out with all these classic villains, and they brought out their team as far as the villains were concerned. Only complaint is that it wasn't long enough. Unfortunately, just gone and left most of me villain merchandise in a different state. I have a bunch of pins, though. Like, yes, I have fallen down the deep, deep well of Disney pin trading. And yes, the vast majority of me pins are villain pins. This one was Halloween 2016. It's one of my favorites because it was an exclusive to Disney Visa card holders. And I had just gotten one, and I was like, well, I have two. It's an exclusive. There's Maleficent, Isma, Kronk, Gaston. This one is one of my absolute favorites. Here is Ratigan coveting an ice cream sundae. I try to grab Hades whenever I can. And Hades is actually the only Disney villain who is voiced by an actual heartless person. This one's another one of my favorites because they re such ex-boyfriends. More of the bitter ex-boyfriends. Villains are a branded thing in the same way that princesses are a branded thing, and fucky is. Only thing is, they remaking new princesses. They aren't really making new villains. I mean, considering the villains that we've gotten the last 5 years, would we add to the ranks of, the Evil Queen and Maleficent, the likes of Hans or, Assistant Mayor Bellwether, or even Tomato, who I think is the closest we've seen to a classic Disney villain in a while, but he's only in the movie for like 5 minutes. The thing about Disney villains and movie villains in general, as opposed to, say, real-world villains, is that we like Disney villains. That's kind of the point. Disney villains are fun. Disney villains. They redesigned to hold your attention, to keep you engaged, but they aren't designed to be repulsive. Like, sure, they rebad and maybe they want to own this lady, but hey, at least they gave her a choice in the matter. Choose me or the fire. Or maybe they kill the brother, but they re not that bad. They wouldn't kill a kid. They'd outsource that. They let the hyenas do it. Kill him. Or the crocodiles do it. Or their well-meaning lunkhead assistant do it. Or, okay, maybe they do kill a kid. But it's only implied and off-screen. And hey, it was war, China. The little girl will be missing her doll. Really, the worst we've seen from the Disney villain is that time that Dr. Facilier squished Jim Cummings' Fly. Oh, movie. You wanted this to be such a moment. Disney villains are getting a bit of a makeover. Here's an entire spin-off dedicated to the complex in our lives of the children of Disney villains. Shere Khan has this tragic backstory. Maleficent is no longer a one-dimensional, spiteful mistress of all evil, but a misunderstood justice fairy who's the victim of a rape allegory. And Beauty and the Beast isn't out yet, but I think we can probably safely assume that Gaston isn't going to get much of a makeover or a tragic backstory. But even then, Gaston is more of a villain in the vein of hands than the likes of, say, Ursula or the Evil Queen or George C. Scott. And despite being a total villain, Stan or hell, maybe even because of it, I actually like Maleficent. Yes, it was hot garbage, but it was me hot garbage. Point is, I'm not opposed to this trend. That's all it really is. It's a trend. Black and white villains are out, and dimensionality and tragic backstories are in. But what have we noticed is that we don't really see the clear-coded, brandable villain anymore so much as plot twists. When it comes to nostalgia, Disney will always have their catalog to fall back on, just like it always trots out its older films. But what about going forward? Are Disney villains going extinct? So classic Disney movies, with some exceptions like Pinocchio and Alice in Wonderland, have a very simple story. A young princess, some sort of villain who hates her for some reason, and then we meet a prince, and love conquers all the end. When Eisner and Katzenberg were hearing pitches from their animators in the mid-80s, part of the reason why they were more keen on The Little Mermaid than Treasure Island in space, besides the fact where it sounded kind of stupid. Little Mermaid harkened back to the classic Disney staples that were still huge draws to the theme parks. A beautiful princess, good versus evil, love conquers all. These were the elements that built the old Disney movies. But when Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg took charge of the company and studio respectively, they added one crucial element that has superseded the original and persists to this day, and that is the search for identity. When will my reflections show who I am inside, there's so much more to me to find where I belong. Give me one day out there, all I ask is on this brought the basic conflict from external to internal. Classic Disney protagonists, again with the exception of Pinocchio, were pretty passive. Things just kind of happened to them. And they weren't searching for anything at the outset other than maybe their one true love, and also, I guess not being a slave would be nice. Renaissance Disney protagonists, on the other hand, might have been looking for their one true love, sure, but usually the true love thing was incidental, and what they really wanted was a coming-of-age sense of identity. They wanted to figure out their place in the world. So how do Disney villains tee in? Did your granny say, listen to your heartbeat, who you are on the inside? I need 3 words to tear her argument apart. Your granny lied, making a conflict about self-identity rather than a simple battle of good versus evil makes the story more complex. A one-dimensional villain can exist in a more complex story. Scarf's manipulations work really well as a contrast to Simba's insecurity in The Lion King, but it can also hamper a story, too. Take the inclusion of Governor Ratcliffe in Pocahontas. Easily the worst thing in an already not that great movie. Let me see how I do it. See, we get this history of fear, violence, bigotry, and genocide. Let's just pin it on this old guy who was easily disposed of. This problem's solved. And Pocahontas never even meets the guy. Just loading the last bit of cargo. A strong narrative tees its elements in neatly. The Lion King is a strong narrative with a flat villain, because the villain's motivation tees in directly with the hero's internal conflict. Same with Hunchback of Notre Dame, only here the villain has a slightly more dimension. Slightly. Frollo felt a twinge of fear for his immortal soul. What must I do? Quasimodo spends his entire life being gaslit by Frollo into believing that he cannot survive in the outside world. Villains' villainy directly tees into heroes' internal conflict as well as their external conflict. Now compare this to Hercules. Hades applies to Hercules' external conflict, but not at all to his internal conflict. Hades doesn't care about Hercules except as an obstacle, foretold by prophecy. Hercules doesn't even know that Hades exists. And Hades doesn't even meet Hercules until the end of the movie. Like, they try to force this thing. Now you know how it feels to be just like everybody else. Isn't it just peachy? But it doesn't make sense that Hades cares at all about Hercules wanting to find his place in the world because they don't know each other. The villain is also one of the weakest elements in The Princess and the Frog. Dr. Facilier is motivated by greed and has no connection to China except through her love interest, Prince Naveen. So this mandatory villain formula that worked so well during the early Renaissance, and it became basically mandatory by the time Pocahontas rolled around, started to make the movies feel stale when it felt like we were just watching the same movie over and over again. Because Disney villains are a brand unto themselves, an element which can be decoupled from its property and sold as its own entity. So up until Tangled, sometimes villains were just jammed in because that's what you do. And once or twice we have a movie where the villain is the best part of the movie while also weakening the movie as a whole. Hades is the best part of Hercules, but his evil plan is contrived and stupid. Dr. Facilier is fun, and he has a great villain song, but his motivation is weak and his connection to the plot is tenuous. Or Governor Ratcliffe. See, he's greedy. And he is the only greedy. But if you get rid of the greedy, then everyone gets along. Colonialism solved. But in this newer era of Disney movies, audiences respond to more complex narratives that are less about good versus evil and more about character development. Look at The Great Mouse Detective, which is a good little movie, but simple. The central conflict of The Great Mouse Detective is Basil versus Ratigan. Good guy, bad guy. They know each other, they hate each other. We don't really know why. We don't need to know. The central conflict in Wreck-It Ralph is Ralph versus society's expectation for his prescribed role which he wants to break out of in society. I mean, they're a character who's the embodiment of that, but I don't remember his name either. This new era of Disney started with the success of Tangled, and with Tangled we got the last real Disney villain, and not a well-loved one at that. Like sometimes I'll get a Mother Gothel in me pins like in one of the villain pin bags, and you better believe she's the first thing that gets traded. Wreck-It Ralph breaks away from the Renaissance Disney mold even further by not only having an older protagonist but by actively subverting these villain tropes. Examining villainous motivations and creating a scenario wherein, with the right incentive, the villain becomes the hero. Big Hero 6 follows a more Marvel mold than a Disney mold, with the villain now allowed to have a tragic backstory with a family and everything. It is not automatically clear that this character will be the villain when we meet him, but by that point that was already a thing. And the whole thing culminates with Lord of All Frozen. Frozen takes a page from Enchanted and also subverts a lot of old Disney tropes, a major plot point being Anna's eagerness to get married. In the earliest drafts, Elsa was the villain, but in one of the more brilliant branding moves of all time, they decide, hey, let's make Elsa the heroine's sister, making a story about sisterhood and reconnecting with family. Hey, Thief Park put your Disney World vacation to the day. Reconnect with that family. Yeah, I'll see you guys Labor Day weekend. As always, thanks for watching. Yeah, I'll see you guys Labor Day weekend. And also we have a love interest that turns out to be the villain. Hans is a bait and switch villain that will also become a thing. Similar to Gaston, yeah, sort of, but look at how Gaston is introduced. But look is similar, yes, said Eutry. How is his first action in the movie is killing an animal, and he is introduced with his sinister, dominating visage in shadow. In Frozen, it isn't until the end of Act 2 that if only there was someone out there who loved you. Snap. Zootopia does this too, and we see Disney moving even further away from the Disney villain formula, as the story in conflict of Zootopia is almost entirely between Judy and Nick. It's a buddy cop movie where the villain really doesn't matter, and the villain ends up being like an Alex Jones fever dream, false flag sheep. Pre-fears predator and you stay in power. Yeah, pretty much. We've reached something of a culmination to the bait-and-switch villain with the resolution to Mona, wherein the evil lava monster we have to defeat at the end, it turns out, is basically under an evil enchantment after Mao stole the MacGuffin from her. And I honestly think this resolution works really well without being predictable. Really well with a let her come to me. The resolution to Mona is directly tied into Mona's quest to figure out who she is. She spends the entire movie trying to figure out why the Osin chose her for this quest, and the bait-and-switch bad guy at the end directly tease into that. Mona's compassion for the monster makes her unique. So the two villains for 2016 were False Flag Sheep and Red Herring Lava Monster. This also tees in with a new but important marketing move: the need for strong male and female leads. And the result is that these movies just don't really have room for Disney villains. But who knows what remains to be seen. In 2018, we're going to see a Jack and the Beanstalk adaptation called Gigantic. Disney, we really need to have a sit down about these titles because they're getting kind of silly. So you can't have Jack and the Beanstalk without Agent, and that should lay the groundwork for a traditional Disney villain. Although I'm giving this an 80-90 chance that it's going to be some big villain. Like the giant is misunderstood and there's an entire gent economy up there, and then there's a good giant and it's going to be about overthrowing the blood of an Englishman-based economy or something. Just saying, Disney's been real big on the whole subversion thing lately. Maybe a little too big. You only got so many trips to subvert. You're going to have to get back to just making stories that aren't, meta. If you start singing, I'm going to throw up. So now we reliving in an age of plots that are less predictable than earlier Disney movies. So new Disney movies are almost fighting against the studio's past as much as they are building on it. And I kind of wonder how quickly people are going to get tired of this, the same way they got tired of the villain versus coming-of-age teenager narrative as they did in the 90s. I mean, look at how quickly people got sick of them. Night Shyamalan in the early 2000s doing more or less the same thing. So US Disney villains, they all continue to be a brandable, associated property. They aren't necessarily going extinct, but they could be an endangered species.